Tank destroyers were very produced vehicles, the most produced by the Germans, and their price effectiveness made them the best armored vehicles of the Second World War. However, these largely disappeared after the end of the conflict, making it so that today there are almost no armored vehicles of this type. But those extracted from new military conflicts in this decade are creating the perfect breeding ground for these to return again. Yes, believe it or not, the current dynamics of armored battles are looking a lot like the ones that gave rise to the enigmatic tank destroyer. Today we will clarify why this is, in order to determine if tank destroyer models could be produced again. So get comfortable, my name is Kevin Aguilar and this is Huns Club. As you probably already know, the tank destroyer was invented by the Germans in 1935 in an attempt to give a second life to the by then outdated Panzer I. These primarily used two MG-13 machine guns as their main armament. To give them superior firepower, a 47mm Skoda anti-tank gun was adapted, being baptized as the Panzerjäger I, receiving a great reception by the high command, taking into account that these were vehicles that otherwise were going to end up in the scrapyard. Other vehicles like the Mater II are also a similar case, only this time on the Panzer II chassis. Upon seeing these armored vehicles in combat, the Germans realized the potential of this concept. These vehicles were extremely cheap to produce and had the ability to effectively destroy tanks without much effort. However, even if they wanted to, they couldn't produce these armored vehicles indefinitely, as there were obviously not an infinite number of Panzer I and I chassis. So the Germans decided to develop a vehicle from scratch to act as a tank destroyer. Fortunately for them, an experimental vehicle that met the characteristics they were looking for had been in development for a few years in the heart of the Reich. One initially based on the Panzer I chassis and later on the Panzer III. This would be the Stuggy III, which was designed to provide heavy support to the infantry, to destroy fortifications and defensive positions, a concept they called an assault weapon. But in 1940, it would see its first battles on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, unexpectedly performing well in destroying enemy armored vehicles. Observing this, the Germans chose to create a Stug III variant better suited for tank destruction. And there was born what we know as the tank destroyer, the Stuggy III. The Stuggy III and IV came in handy for the Germans for 1942. The turretless Stuggy III, based on the Panzer III chassis, was a cost-effective solution to the Axis's tank casualty problem. Compared to the Panzer IV's $440,000 price tag, the Stuggy III cost only $350,000, saving between $60,000 and $90,000 per vehicle, depending on various factors. The Stuggy III was cost-effective because creating a new armored vehicle required infrastructure, machines, and a dedicated production line. To save costs, armored vehicles of the era commonly shared components like cannons, suspensions, and tracks. The savings not only came in the acquisition of the armored vehicle, but also in operating it. They were basically a Panzer III without a turret, so mechanically they were very simple compared to tanks like the Panzer IV, Panzer VI Tiger, or the Panzer V. Okay, the Stuggy was cheap, but was it effective? Well, it is estimated that the Stuggy III caused over 30,000 enemy vehicle casualties in total. 10,000 of these were produced, and there were also other tank destroyer models like the Hetzer or the Jagdpanzer, or based on the Panzer IV chassis. This last fact despite General Guderian's refusal, as he considered these vehicles useless since the very similar Stuggy III and IV was already in production. Seeing the success of these vehicles, the Soviets would end up creating their own, having probably much more imposing models, like the ISU-152. This thing was scary. In addition, of course, the Americans also made their own. A very interesting model was the T-28, my personal favorite armored vehicle. All of this led to such a proliferation of these vehicles that there were large tank battles all over Europe. The main battle tank or main battle tank. These tanks were the main battle tank or main battle tank. These tanks had the ability to fulfill the role of tank destroyers as well as that of a medium tank. They also, of course, supported the infantry and could penetrate and destroy enemy defenses. It was cheaper to have a single main armored vehicle for all roles than to have one for each. So when the MBTs began to appear, the tank destroyers also began to disappear, as well as the whole range of armored vehicles we saw in World War II. From the appearance of the tank destroyer, we can draw several important characteristics that were key to its development. For example, as we can see, they arose from the need to create cheaper vehicles to save money, and also these arose to be able to feed a conflict that demanded more and more armored vehicles because they were easier to produce. Another good reason for their appearance was that they were partially easier to protect from infantry anti-tank countermeasures thanks to having a very low profile and not having a turret. An example of this latter were the Schürzen plates. They could cover almost the entire tank thanks to it not having a turret, making it very difficult for anti-tank rifle shots and HIT projectiles to cause damage. These three factors, the need to cut costs, the need to manufacture more armored vehicles in less time, and also better protect them from infantry, we can also see them in modern warfare. For example, let's look at the current ongoing Russian-Ukrainian conflict. In this conflict, main battle tank armored vehicles, both Western and of Soviet origin, are suffering really alarming casualties. Not because they are bad tanks, but because the intensity of the conflict is such that no tank is exempt from being destroyed. In each small skirmish, both sides can lose up to 100 armored vehicles. Currently, MBTs are very expensive to replace, much more so than in the Cold War and World War II era. This has caused a general shortage of tanks on both sides. Russia, for example, has had to mobilize out-of-service tanks like the old T-5455, which is crazy since these tanks are over 80 years old. We would never have imagined that tanks are becoming increasingly difficult to protect. Nowadays, even a simple soldier can destroy a tank. Drones, anti-tank weapons, for infantry, precise artillery, rockets, and missiles, tanks have never been so vulnerable, even much more than in World War II. This has contributed to the great shortage of tanks that we have previously discussed. We are seeing this in Russia, but as it happened to Russia, it could also happen to any nation that gets fully involved in a high-intensity conflict. Now, this is caused by a conflict in a small territory. Can you imagine what would happen with a conflict on the scale of the Second World War today? Or we wouldn't have to escalate that much. What would happen if, for example, 2 NATO nations were to start a war today with Russia? This would be a complete disaster for this nation, and we are talking about a fully industrialized nation. Obviously, in any nation, this could be a big problem, so as happened in the Second World War. For the new modern war, we need tanks that are very cheap to operate and produce, that are easy to produce so that these can be produced by the dozens in just a few days, and whose design makes it easier to better protect them from anti-tank weapons, both from infantry and launched by drones. All this without compromising the protection that the current MBT armored vehicles already provide. So, what kind of vehicle do you think could meet these demands? That's right, the tank destroyers. Vehicles like the Star V103 were economical and curious models. For instance, a Star V103 cost $230,000. To be manufactured today, its extremely low profile was evident it would be very difficult. Today, its extremely low profile was evident it would be very difficult to hit under any circumstance. Protecting a turretless vehicle from drones or rockets would be very simple, by not making the upper half of your tank mobile. And of course, these can defeat other armored vehicles without problems in a critical situation of intense war, like the one the Germans experienced in 1942 or like the one Russia is in, which we hope not, could become even more intense. Take a chassis that you already produce and put a turretless cannon on it to save about half the value of the armored vehicle that you're producing. Sounds like a great idea, especially considering that you're really not losing that many features as a result. Although we don't know the future, current conflicts seem to favor cheap and easily replaceable armored vehicles, making it possible that in a few years we may see these legendary vehicles again on the battlefields. Consider this conceptual art depicting an Abrams tank without a turret. Do you think something like this would be useful to us today? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Goodbye.